Thank you for staying with us. If you're just joining us, you only made it for the second half of the show. This is Report Desk Africa, and we're talking about coups. We started with the coup in Gabon, but now we're going to the rest of Africa. Now, in the face of rising threats to democracy and the civic space in the West African sub-region, human rights activists and heads of civil society groups have condemned the recent military takeover in Niger with demands to release the deposed president, Mohammed Bazoum. Now, this call was made at the 2023 West Africa Civil Society Week, where several deliberations were made as it concerns strengthening the West African integration void of foreign interference and exploitation. The alleged takeover has also sparked condemnation from the African Union about contagious autocracy on a continent where military forces have seized power in 5 other countries since 2020. News Central's Adesewa Odusoga helps us understand the situation of things in this particular report that you are about to watch.
The Sahel region of West Africa is seeing an increase in military takeovers, which suggests regional instability and a threat to its democracy. Rising insecurity, poor economic conditions, and corrupt practices by elected officials are prompting the people to turn against democratic governance, ushering in coups, which is now evident in 5 countries in the Sahel region. These form part of the discussion at the 2023 West Africa Civil Society Week in Lagos, Nigeria, where members deliberated on how to bridge the knowledge gap in policy and implementation to enable them to make the most impact in attaining peace in the region.
Why are we having the masses supporting these coups? And the answer is because for many of them, democracy has not yielded the fruits that it promised, the developments that it's promised. For a number of countries, particularly those that we are seeing some of these coup d'etats happening, you had unconstitutional changes in government, and we did not have any major response to stop those from happening.
There's a need to reverse the situation there, or else it will have a sort of boomerang effect. So it's against that background of entrenching and making sure the consolidation of democracy is right, to put what has been wrong right. That's why ECOWAS was advocating that there's the need for a constitutional order to come to these 4 countries that have had a military coup.
Nigerian human rights lawyer Femi Falana, who joined virtually, noted that the current conduct of democracy in West Africa lowers expectations for the people to defend it when it is under threat. To make an impact, civil society groups are urged to deepen integration in the West African region with calls for a common currency and institutions.
It's a time for civil society to begin to rethink their role in consolidating democracy. It's a time for us to foster our solidarity. It's a time for us to work collectively rather than, in silos. It's a time for us to bring our efforts together and really see how we can push forward the democratic agenda. We need to ensure that the democracy that we have, it's not perfect, but we must find a way to sustain and consolidate it rather than lose it all.
The mounting threat to democracy, foreign exploitations, and abuse to fundamental rights, amongst others, top the list here for civil society groups in the region. There were calls to uphold a people-centered democracy, void of foreign interference, and adopt a Pan-African philosophy. Adesewa Odusoga, reporting for News Central.
And when the topic is big is when we bring the big masquerade to come and discuss it. But we don't have a masquerade here, but we have our executive head of News Central Television, Uzonna Ononye. This is the time where I don't get to call you boss, so thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us.
That's all right.
Jumping straight into it now, of course, let's look at some of the conspiracy theories that have been surrounding the coups, not just in Gabon, but across the African sub-region now. And I believe that you've heard some of them. Just like we had in the Twitter space discussion at News Central about an hour ago, there were discussions as to how there's the hand of some foreign influence in some of these coups, or possible hand of some of this foreign influence on some of these coups. What's your take on this?
While it has been difficult up to this moment to categorically state that any foreign interest is responsible for the coup in some countries in Africa, it may be quite difficult also to say that it's completely out of the way, because most African countries do not exist on their own. They are tied to the apron string of one superpower somewhere. And so for them to even have good education, the kind of whatever good education means in those countries, the influence of those foreign countries, foreign superpowers, will always be there. They live by grants and loans and all manner of handouts from those big countries. So it is not impossible for anything to happen without the influence of those big superpowers. However, in some cases, the picture is clearer than in other cases. For instance, in Niger, as soon as the coup took place, some countries began to throw their weight around, including France and some other Western countries. And then Russia wasn't quiet, or completely silent, in as much as it didn't come in fully to show its hands. So it's clear that in some cases, coups in Africa is being sponsored and coordinated by Western or external influence, without being specific to Western or Eastern.
Okay, and now talking about, like they say in mathematics, the LCM, the common multiple across these countries. Now, one very common factor we are seeing is that most of these countries, if not all of them, were former colonies of France. But besides that, there's also a group or a string of, would I say, common factors that is making, or that would make some experts begin to fear that if you look at other African countries around this region, it may just spread to certain other countries. What are some of these factors that you think we should be wary about, we should be looking into at the moment?
One major factor across most of the countries where coup had taken place recently is bad leadership. And that's why some people say that whatever is going on in Africa right now is a referendum on the kind of leadership that is seen on the continent. Using specific example of the president of Gabon, the ousted president of Gabon, he wasn't in a very good health, yet he stuck to power and then found ways of bringing in his son so that he will continue the family legacy of sustaining or keeping the presidency of Gabon as a family heritage from his father to him and from him to his son. So the picture is similar in some other parts of Africa. That's why as soon as the coup in Gabon took place, people began to point fingers to where they think should be next. Some people mentioned Cameroon, some people mentioned Uganda, and between these two countries, they have presidents that have been in power for more than 30 years each, and they are not less than 80 years of age, the two presidents. And so you see the factors, the similarities are quite obvious, but the bottom line, or what is connecting all the African countries where all of these coups are taking place, is bad leadership, where a country is so rich yet so poor, where the country is blessed with lots of resources that could turn it to a competing power globally, yet the people live in penury. And so when you have a situation like this, a time will come when the people will find their voice in whatever manner. Perhaps that is why after each of the coups that are taking place recently, you will see the people troop out to the streets to celebrate. Yeah, whether that celebration will last for long or will be short-lived, we will not be sure about that, presently. So it's a common factor that people are tired of the kind of leadership we have in Africa, a continent that you find the best of weather, the richest of natural resources, and the richest of everything you can imagine, except one, leadership. Yeah. And so it's a worry. And that's why many African countries, even though they've not seen coup, they are fidgeting, they are worried, they are concerned, because if nothing is done, it is likely that in the coming days or weeks, the wind will begin to blow in their direction. And so that's just the simple truth of what we have on the continent right now.
It's quite interesting you mentioned that because as we heard earlier today, the likes of Cameroon and Rwanda have begun to restructure their military architecture. Some are saying it's because they may be foreseeing certain things to come. But moving away from these countries now to the regional bloc, and I'm talking the large regional bloc now, AU. The African Union, it has become cliche to see the African Union say they condemn the coups happening in certain countries. But now there's a school of thought that is saying the major issue is not being addressed, and like you rightly mentioned, bad leadership in African countries. What can the African Union possibly do concerning leadership, knowing that these countries are, they are autonomous entities, they have their own sovereignty to protect? Is there anything that the African Union can do?
African Union, by its structure, do not have supremacy over any country. I mean, all they do is to either condemn or approve sanctions, and they condemn one form of coup and ignore the other. They condemn military coup, but ignore constitutional coup, where a certain democratically elected president will manipulate the constitution of the country to ensure he stays endlessly in power. African Union wouldn't say anything. Where an elected president uses the power of his office to bully and intimidate other arms of government, i.e. the judiciary and the legislature, African Union will be quiet. But when there is a military uprising, then African Union jumps out to condemn it. Is it possible that African Union is a collection or a cult of some sort, where people that are advantaged to have found themselves in position of leadership get into to protect one another without giving concerns or being worried about the people or the interest of the people they were elected to lead? There are very, very serious questions. Coming directly to your question, what else can the African Union do? African Union will need to look inwards, first of all, and redefine why the organization was formed in the first place. If it was founded to bring Africa together, then it's high time it began to, live to that reason that it was founded. What is the interest of Africa? Who defines what democracy is in the first place? Because anytime we talk about this, you protect democracy. If democracy, as people that brought it to Africa, defined it, government of the people, for the people, and for the people, by the people, for the people. If that is the real definition of democracy, then allow each people to develop how they want to be governed. A certain learned Nigerian said one time that, observing what Nigeria has done with democracy, that it is possible to debate, put it on the table, and debate whether the form of democracy we have is actually what suits Nigeria. He is not proposing military intervention, but to review our own type of democracy. So African Union should begin to channel its energy towards finding what works for the entire continent, towards finding what is suitable for each, because Africa is one, yes, but we are diverse in different ways, and we have different interests and different concerns. And so it is better for the AU to put its energy to find out what works for the continent most, instead of picking and choosing when to wake up to condemn and when to go to sleep.
Very true. We had this conversation yesterday in the newsroom, and we're talking about the same thing. Is the current democracy that African countries running, is it actually working for Africa? And I have my own suggestion. I think we should call African democracy something like Afrocracy, maybe. If that makes it
you have to be careful, very careful with that Afro, because once you remove the Afro, the next thing that comes after it sounds like crazy. I mean, it don't mean a different thing entirely.
Exactly. And just before we let you go, one final question I want to ask. Now, as we mentioned earlier, most of the coups we've been seeing have affected, if not all, recently, have affected Francophone countries, suggesting that there is something that has to do with France, maybe. But as it is now, there are those who are saying even the Anglophone countries should be wary and should look over their shoulders. Do you think that? I mean, I can still remember some of the coups that took place in Nigeria. The likes of Babangida coup and the one that brought General Sani Abacha also into power. And we know the kind of things that happened back then. We've not seen any of that lately, just the Francophone countries. But do you think that the or rather, let me put it this way. What do you think the Anglophone countries are doing right to avoid coups spreading this way? Or is it just a matter of time?
I am tempted to just jump on it and say it's a matter of time. But being a bit more analytical, you would discover that Francophone countries have certain peculiarities that they have. And it is said that France gave them civil rule, but not independence. That most of those countries are still tied very closely to France in almost everything that they do, their economy, their military, and to the extent that who becomes what is determined in Paris. And so because of that, you know, the agitation for self-determination will be fierce in those areas more than in other places where it is not exactly the same. But don't forget that the major factor that seemed to have led to the frequency of coup on the continent is bad leadership, poverty, injustice. If this is correct, then Anglophone countries are not safe either, because same situation exists in those places as we find them in Francophone countries. Yes, the numbers seem to favor Anglophone countries, because out of 7 countries on the continent right now that are being controlled by military government, 6 of them are Francophone countries, except for Sudan, you know. And so, yeah, the number seems to favor Anglophone countries. However, the fundamental, which is bad leadership, poverty, and the rest, exists in Anglophone countries as much as it exists in Francophone countries.
Thank you so much, Uzonna Ononye, head of news. I know that this conversation is still going to continue in the newsroom and beyond. Once again, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
My pleasure.